For 22-year-old Jonna Jackson, it was a total mistake to marry her husband 2 years ago. Even though she already had 2 children with him, she was sick and tired of this lack of responsibility. He would not go to work, take care of his family, and spent all his days smoking marijuana and drinking. She had been with him for almost 2 years. Their rent and money for groceries, however, it was paid for by her parents. That day, Jackson, who saw her husband still lying on the couch and drinking, had no inner turmoil. She quietly packed her bags and left with her 2 children, and the following year, her petition for divorce was granted. On December 20th, 1984, at approximately 11 p.m. in Wichita Falls, Texas, a part-time EKG physician at Bethania Hospital, Terry Lee Sims, 20-year-old, and her coworker Leza Boone rode together to the home of a mutual friend of theirs to exchange Christmas gifts after working the night shift. Because Sims' final exams were coming up in a few days, Boone intended to tutor her in her studies, so she invited Sims to spend the night at her apartment. However, unexpectedly, Boone received a call from the hospital requesting her to return to the hospital for the night shift. So Boone gave Sims the keys to her apartment, and she intended to drive Sims to her apartment before going to her night shift. Around 12:30 a.m., Boone had dropped Sims off at her apartment, and she immediately rushed to the hospital. And the time came around 7:30 a.m., Boone's work was done, and feeling tired, she drove back to her apartment. But because her key had been given to Sims, she had to keep knocking on the door outside of her room, but she got no answer. So Boone found the landlord and got a spare key. At first, Boone thought that Sims was still asleep, but as she slowly entered the apartment, the living room was cluttered and ransacked. In order to get help as well as to find Sims, so Boone approached the landlord to ask for help, and eventually, the 2 of them found Sims in the bathroom covered in blood on the floor. The police and the coroner were called to the scene, and the coroner found that Sims had been sexually assaulted and stabbed to death. Based on her injuries and the marks left in the house, police believe that Sims was home alone at the time, and that for some reason she went out to check on the house and may have seen the murderer. So she panicked and ran back into the apartment, and that the murderer followed her, forcibly grabbed her, and then tied her hands and sexually assaulted and killed her. In the end, investigators kept the semen sample and fingerprints the killer found on Sims' body in case they could be used to catch the killer in the future. No one expected that this murder to be not the end, but the beginning. On January 19, 1985, 23-year-old Tony Zhang Gibbs, who was a nurse, disappeared while working at Wichita General Hospital. 2 days later, police found Gibbs' car a few miles away from the hospital, and on February 15th, her body was found in a field next to a highway, where, according to the autopsy report, she had 8 stab wounds and had been sexually assaulted. Police found an abandoned school bus near the scene where the body was found, and they suspect that's where the killer may have carried out the attack, as they also found Gibbs' clothes in the bus. 24-year-old Danny Laughlin was initially suspected by police of murdering Gibbs because he often rode his motorcycle near the place where Gibbs was killed and made statements about the murder. And Danny had seen Gibbs at a nightclub a few days before the murder, and he failed a polygraph test, so Danny was subsequently brought to trial. However, after 2 days of deliberation, the case stalled and Danny was acquitted, as his DNA did not successfully match the DNA at the murder scene, and the police did not have any evidence regarding his direct killing. 2 months later at night in Fort Worth, Texas, a 25-year-old girl named Deborah Taylor was dancing at a bar with her husband. As the time came to midnight, her husband was feeling tired, so he went back to his home early while Deborah remained at the bar. Then a man approached her and asked her to dance. Without any hesitation, Deborah accepted the man's request, and both of them stayed there for a long time. As the time approached early morning, Deborah was ready to go home. The man was very gentlemanly and invited her to get in the car and drove her home. In the car, the man tried to sexually tease Deborah. She had a husband, so she refused the man. However, this completely enraged the man, and he killed her and left her body at a construction site in East Fort Worth. When Deborah did not return home the next day, her husband reported her missing, and on March 29th, Deborah's body was found by 2 construction workers. At first, the police believed it was a case of wife murder, and they always suspected Deborah's husband, even after he passed 3 polygraphs. The police's suspicions utterly destroyed the man's life, and his family and Deborah's family didn't believe him for a second. 6 months later, on September 20th, 1985, a student at Midwestern State University in Wichita Falls, 21-year-old Ellen Blau, had just quit her job as a night clerk and was then abducted while walking alone to her car. On October 10th, a road crew found a body in a Wichita County field. The body was in such a state of decomposition that the medical examiner was only able to identify the victim by comparing dental records. And ultimately, the victim was identified as Ellen, who, according to the report, was most likely sexually assaulted because her underwear had been artificially removed. But due to the condition of her remains, an accurate analysis could not be performed. Tina Elizabeth Kimbrough, a 21-year-old waitress, invited a man she had recently met to her apartment on May 6, 1986. However, when the man arrived at the apartment, instead of a friendly get-together, Tina was forcefully muffled to death with a pillow by the man. After the police responded, several neighbors told them that they had seen an unknown man, approximately 6 feet tall, with dark brown hair and a baseball cap leaving the apartment. Police suspicion remained with Danny, who had been suspected by police of being involved in Gibbs' death, and after getting a suspect description from a witness, Danny was ruled out as he did not fit the description. A few days later, on May 9th, a 27-year-old man named Faryion Edward Wardrip called the police and threatened to kill himself. When the officers arrived, Wardrip confessed to the murder of Tina, and ultimately, he was sentenced to 35 years in prison, and it is noteworthy that he was Jackson's husband, the drug and alcohol addicted all day with no responsible man. Born in Salem, Indiana, on March 6, 1959, Wardrip was the first child of his parents, in addition to his 2 younger brothers, and no information has ever been revealed as to whether or not Wardrip suffered emotional or physical abuse from his parents or anyone else during his childhood. After dropping out of high school at the age of 19, Wardrip joined the United States National Guard, from which he was dishonorably discharged after a few years of service because of Wardrip's frequent use of marijuana, disorderly conduct, and numerous absences from work. Wardrip's drug and alcohol abuse grew worse as the days went by, and after he got married, his behavior did not change in the least, and he did not do anything about it, even when Jackson took their 2 children away. On December 11, 1997, Wardrip was paroled and moved to Olney, Texas, where he remarried and became an active supporter of his local church, which gave him a good reputation, and he found work in a factory. In early 1999, a Wichita Falls investigator began an investigation into the unsolved murders of Sims, Gibbs, and Ellen, which took place in the same area and died in somewhat the same manner. All of the victims were white females, all between the ages of 20 and 25 years old, and all of the victims were sexually assaulted, and DNA extracted from the murder scenes of Sims and Gibbs were later successfully matched and showed that both victims were murdered by the same person. A fellow investigator revealed a tip about Ellen. When Wardrip was on trial for the murder of Tina, he admitted that he knew Ellen. This tip was not taken seriously, but as this investigator investigated, he realized that all 3 murders appeared to be linked to Wardrip. Wardrip had been working at the same hospital as Gibbs. He knew Ellen. Sims' body was found only 2 blocks from his apartment, and he had a prior conviction for Tina's murder. But at the time, the police had not collected a DNA sample from Wardrip to test whether he was the killer. On February 5, 1999, that investigator was pretending to do laundry at a self-service laundromat across the street, and when he saw Wardrip going for a cup of coffee, he put a small pinch of tobacco in his mouth and asked Wardrip if he could spit from his coffee cup. Wardrip agreed, and then the investigator took the coffee cup directly to the testing room to extract a DNA sample, which was then compared with the murderer samples of Sims and Gibbs, and the match was successful. On February 14th, police arrested Wardrip, and during his trial, he confessed to not only the murders of Sims, Gibbs, and Ellen, but also to the murder of Deborah, whose husband was cleared of all wrongdoing, but whose life was ruined. On November 9th, Wardrip was sentenced to death and 3 life sentences for the murders of Sims, Gibbs, Ellen, and Deborah. In 2008, a federal district judge recommended that Wardrip's death sentence be overturned because they felt he had not been given an effective defense at trial. On June 14, 2011, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit reversed a lower court decision that had ordered the state of Texas to either hold a new sentencing trial for Wardrip or agree to sentence him to life in prison. In December 2014, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals denied Wardrip's appeal of ineffective assistance of counsel. In September 2020, a federal appeals court denied his motion for a new trial and reinstated his death sentence, which they had previously halted. And to this day, Wardrip remains on death row.